The papacy, one of the most fascinating and enduring institutions in human history. For nearly 2 millennia, the Pope has been the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, a figure cloaked in both reverence and mystery. Think about it. A single man, wearing a slightly oversized hat, wielding spiritual authority that has shaped nations, brokered peace, inspired art, and occasionally sparked a scandal or two. It's a job with a description that reads somewhere between shepherd of souls and global diplomat, with a pinch of historical drama protagonist thrown in for good measure. But why talk about popes today? Because not all popes are created equal. Let's be honest, the papal history is a mixed bag. Some popes were so saintly, they practically floated above their thrones. Others, well, let's just say they could give Machiavelli a run for his money. Yet in the sea of pontiffs, some truly stand out as transformative figures who left the world better than they found it. These are the popes who went beyond blessing crowds in St. Peter's Square. They reformed a church, stood firm in the face of adversity, and even nudged humanity a little closer to peace. Now, how do we define the best when it comes to popes? That's no small feat. Do we focus on their spiritual depth, their knack for steering the church through rough waters, their political savvy, perhaps, or how about their ability to inspire hope and unite people? Honestly, it's probably a mix of all that, plus a bit of divine grace. If you're into that sort of thing, we're looking for popes who not only rocked the white cassock, but also rocked the world. And here's the fun part. We're not claiming to have the ultimate end-all be-all list. No, this is just one take, my take, and it's bound to spark some debate. After all, history is nothing if not subjective, and the papacy is no exception. So, as we dive into this list of legendary pontiffs, I want to hear from you. Who's your pick for the greatest pope in history? Got a favorite? Maybe someone I missed? Drop it in the comments. Let's hash it out. Respectfully, of course. After all, even popes had to deal with plenty of heated disagreements. If they can handle it, so can we. So buckle up, grab your rosaries, or your historical curiosity, and let's journey through a list of men who, love them or not, helped shape the course of history in ways we're still feeling today. Spoiler alert, it's going to get pretty inspiring, and maybe just a little dramatic.
Before we delve in deeper, please take 5 seconds to like this video and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on similar videos. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Back to our discussion.
Pope John Paul II was not just a man in white robes walking the halls of the Vatican. He was a spiritual warrior with a sly sense of timing and a knack for shaking things up. Born Karol Józef Wojtyła in Wadowicz, Poland, this pontiff had lived under the twin terrors of Nazism and communism. He wasn't the type to sit idly by while oppressive regimes stomped over human dignity. No, he had bigger plans that would involve challenging the very foundations of communism while inspiring millions. And he did it all with a smile that could disarm even the staunchest dictator. When John Paul II became pope in 1978, communism was entrenched in Eastern Europe like a grumpy tenant who refuses to move out. But this was no ordinary landlord. He had lived the communist experience firsthand in Poland, where the regime's atheistic propaganda tried, and utterly failed, to snuff out the Catholic Church. So when he returned to Poland in 1979 for his first papal visit, it wasn't just a homecoming. It was an electric moment of defiance. Over 3 million Poles gathered to see him, not because they suddenly developed a keen interest in liturgical proceedings, but because John Paul II represented something communism couldn't offer: hope, faith, and let's be honest, a bit of good old-fashioned Polish stubbornness. His words were like spiritual dynamite. "Do not be afraid," he told the crowds. Now that might sound like something you'd find on an inspirational fridge magnet, but in 1979 Poland, it was a rallying cry against a regime that thrived on fear. People listened. They sang hymns. They cried. Even the communist officials, who were presumably hiding behind their curtains and sweating profusely, knew this was trouble. The Pope wasn't leading a political party or raising an army. He was doing something much scarier to totalitarian regimes. He was inspiring people to think for themselves. Fast forward a few years, and we get to Solidarity, the Polish labor movement that chipped away at the communist stranglehold on the country. Was John Paul II its official leader? No. Did he fan its flames with his support and moral authority? Absolutely. He was like that cool uncle who doesn't directly tell you to rebel against the system, but gives you the tools and confidence to do it anyway. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, John Paul II's role was undeniable. He didn't bring it down brick by brick, but his relentless advocacy for human dignity and freedom loosened the mortar. And let's not forget his interfaith dialogue. The man didn't just want to end communism. He wanted the world to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, metaphorically, of course. He became the first pope to visit a synagogue and later a mosque, which, let's face it, probably caused a few traditionalists to choke on their communion wafers. But John Paul II was all about breaking down barriers. He met with Jewish leaders, Muslim clerics, Buddhist monks, and even the Dalai Lama, proving that you could wear a mitre and still have an open mind. Then there was his emphasis on human rights. If there was a global stage, John Paul II found a way to step onto it and demand better treatment for the downtrodden. He wasn't shy about calling out injustices, whether they came from communist leaders, Western powers, or corporations that prioritize profits over people. He was the kind of pope who could meet a dictator, shake their hand for the cameras, and then tell them, with that trademark twinkle in his eye, that they should really stop oppressing their citizens. John Paul II wasn't perfect, no human is, but he was undoubtedly a pope who left a mark. He outwitted communism with faith and persistence, brought religions to the same table, even if they sometimes awkwardly sat on opposite ends, and championed human rights with a fervor that made even world leaders take notice. And all the while, he managed to exude the kind of charisma that made people believe he genuinely cared, which of course he did. Not bad for a man who started as a theater-loving kid from a small Polish town. Pope Paul VI was like the church's cool uncle who showed up at a family reunion, looked around, and said, "Okay, we need to update things around here." Born Giovanni Battista Montini, he became pope in 1963, inheriting the whirlwind that was the Second Vatican Council, initiated by his predecessor, Pope John XXIII. The council was a seismic event that aimed to bring the church into the modern age, and Paul VI took it upon himself to see it through to completion. If Vatican II were a rock concert, Paul VI was the headliner who had to play after the opening act brought the house down. No pressure. One of the boldest moves under his watch was saying, "You know what? Let's not make people feel like outsiders at Massachusetts." He oversaw reforms that allowed the Mass to be celebrated in local languages instead of Latin. Suddenly, Catholics could actually understand what was being said, which was revolutionary and a bit shocking. Imagine sitting in the pews your whole life and finally realizing the priest wasn't casting spells, he was just praying. This change was monumental and made the church feel more accessible. But, of course, not everyone was thrilled. Traditionalists clutched their rosaries muttering, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," while others saw it as a much-needed breath of fresh air. Paul VI wasn't just about shaking things up inside the church. He had his eyes on the world stage, too. In an era defined by Cold War tensions, he believed dialogue could melt even the iciest barriers. He made history by becoming the first pope to visit the Holy Land in nearly 2,000 years. Picture it, a pope standing on the soil where Jesus walked. It was as if the church had hit the reset button on its relationship with Christianity's roots. He didn't stop there. Paul VI also reached out to leaders of other religions, including Orthodox Christians, Anglicans, and even those outside the Christian fold. He wasn't trying to convert them or start a debate. He just wanted to talk. One of his most iconic gestures was meeting the Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras I, in 1964. It was the ecclesiastical equivalent of two estranged cousins reuniting after centuries of awkward family feuds. These two spiritual leaders actually embraced, yes, a hug between a pope and a patriarch. If that doesn't scream progress, I don't know what does. Together, they lifted mutual excommunications that had been in place since 1054. You know, just a casual 910-year-long grudge. No big deal, but it wasn't all kumbayas and warm fuzzies. Paul VI also tackled some thorny issues, like birth control. His encyclical Humani Vitae reaffirmed the Church's stance against artificial contraception, sparking a firestorm of debate. Critics argued he was out of touch, while supporters saw him as a steadfast guardian of Church teaching. Love him or loathe him, one thing was clear. Paul VI wasn't afraid to take a stand, even if it made him unpopular. Despite his serious undertakings, Paul VI had a certain charisma that often gets overlooked. He wasn't the most outgoing pope, but he had a knack for connecting with people when it mattered. There's an anecdote about him being approached by a young boy who asked, "Are you the pope?" Paul VI smiled and replied, "Yes, but don't tell anyone." That subtle humor, paired with his genuine warmth, endeared him to many. When Paul VI passed away in 1978, he left behind a church that was forever changed. His papacy was a bridge between the old and the new, a balancing act that required wisdom, courage, and a touch of humility. He didn't just implement reforms. He shepherded a global community through one of its most transformative periods. Whether you see him as a trailblazer or a traditionalist at heart, one thing's for sure. Pope Paul VI knew how to leave an impression, and not just on the Vatican stationery. Pope Gregory VII was not your average medieval pope. He was a man on a mission to remind the world who's boss, heavenly boss, that is. The 11th century was a wild time when kings and emperors thought they could play church like a game of chess, appointing bishops and abbots as if they were pawns in their grand schemes. Gregory VII, however, had other ideas. He didn't just draw a line in the sand. He drew a heavenly one and dared anyone to cross it. Spoiler alert, plenty tried. Imagine the scene. King Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, a young and confident ruler, struts around like he owns not only his kingdom, but also the clergy within it. After all, why shouldn't he decide who wears the mitres and waves the croziers? Gregory, a former monk with a knack for reform and a zeal for divine order, decided enough was enough. He issued a decree that might as well have come with a flashing neon sign: no more lay investiture. Translation: secular rulers could no longer appoint bishops. That was God's business, and Gregory was pretty sure he had God's backing on this one. Henry IV was not amused. In fact, he was furious. A medieval monarch being told no was about as rare as a unicorn sighting, and Henry wasn't about to let some pope cramp his style. So in a move that screamed teenage rebellion, Henry convened a council of bishops loyal to him and declared Gregory deposed. To which Gregory replied, "Oh really?" and promptly excommunicated Henry. For a medieval king, being excommunicated wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was like being unfriended by God himself. Your subjects would whisper behind your back, your allies would ghost you, and your enemies would see an opportunity to pounce. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in church-state relations. Henry, realizing he was in deep holy water, made the long and humiliating journey to Canossa in the winter of 1077. Picture this: the Holy Roman Emperor shivering in the snow, standing barefoot outside the gates of the castle where Gregory was staying, begging for forgiveness. It's said he waited 3 days before Gregory finally let him in. This wasn't just a power move. It was the medieval equivalent of blocking someone's number and then making them leave 20 voicemails before you consider answering. Gregory's reforms didn't stop at humiliating emperors. He was on a crusade, metaphorically speaking, to ensure that the clergy were independent from secular rulers. No more simony, selling church offices like they were tickets to a medieval concert. No more bishops serving two masters, God and the king. Gregory wanted bishops to focus on their flocks, their faith, and their heavenly duties, not on pleasing their earthly overlords. His vision was bold, and his methods were even bolder. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with Gregory's reforms. Some saw him as a meddler, others as a revolutionary. He was accused of overstepping, of being too rigid, too uncompromising. But Gregory didn't care. He wasn't in it for popularity points. He was in it for the salvation of souls and the sanctity of the church. Gregory's life ended in exile, thanks to Henry's eventual military retaliation, but his legacy was anything but defeated. The principles he championed during the investiture controversy reshaped the relationship between church and state for centuries. Gregory VII was a pope who didn't just hold the keys of St. Peter. He wielded them with conviction, daring kings and emperors to test the strength of his resolve. And test it they did. But Gregory never flinched. A pope like him doesn't just make history, he demands it. Pope Innocent III. What a name, right? It's almost misleading, because innocent isn't exactly the first word that comes to mind when you hear about his iron-fisted reign as pope. If medieval Europe was a chaotic banquet where kings and emperors bickered over the last drumstick, Innocent III was the guy who slammed his goblet down and declared, "All right, everyone, sit down. I'm in charge now." And you know what? They actually listened. Well, sort of. Innocent wasn't just a pope. He was the pope. He wasn't interested in being a figurehead who waved from the Vatican balcony. Not that there were balconies back then. He wanted to roll up his sleeves and show the world who was boss. To him, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual shepherd. He was the shepherd and the wolf, with a knack for making even the most stubborn rulers quake in their boots. He declared that popes were above kings and emperors, literally the highest authority on earth. That's some serious know-your-place energy, and the medieval world hadn't quite seen anything like it. One of his most famous power moves was excommunicating King John of England. Yes, the same King John of Robin Hood fame, who spent his days losing wars, taxing peasants, and being a general nuisance. When John refused to accept Innocent's choice for Archbishop of Canterbury, Innocent essentially locked the doors of the church in England and said, "No mass for you." For 6 years, England was under interdict, which meant no sacraments, no weddings, no Christian burials, just a lot of awkward Sundays. Eventually, John folded like a bad hand of cards and even declared England a vassal state of the papacy. Talk about a mic drop. But Innocent wasn't just a master of political chess. He was also a man of vision. In 1215, he convened the Fourth Lateran Council, one of the most important gatherings in church history. Think of it as the medieval version of a TED Talk, but with less PowerPoint and more incense. Over 1,200 bishops, abbots, and clergy attended, and they hashed out a laundry list of reforms that would shape the church for centuries. Innocent didn't do things halfway. He wanted everything addressed, from heresy to clergy conduct to what bread should be used for the Eucharist. It was the council that made transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine literally become the body and blood of Christ, official church doctrine. And let's be honest, that's a pretty heavy theological flex. Of course, Innocent's sense of righteousness wasn't always a laughing matter. He was a driving force behind the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal campaign against the Cathars, a heretical sect in southern France. His orders led to some horrific violence, with crusaders famously being told to kill them all. God will know his own. Not exactly a shining moment in church history, but it shows just how determined Innocent was to protect orthodoxy, even if his methods were, let's say, less than innocent. By the time he passed away in 1216, Innocent III had left an indelible mark on history. Love him or hate him, the man redefined what it meant to be pope. He wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a kingmaker, a reformer, and, occasionally, a medieval enforcer with a divine mandate. If popes were Marvel characters, Innocent III wouldn't be the friendly neighborhood spider pope. He'd be more like Doctor Strange, bending reality and wielding unimaginable power while reminding everyone he's the sorcerer supreme. And in his case, there was no arguing about it. Pope John XXII, affectionately nicknamed Good Pope John, was the kind of pope you might invite to your family dinner. Not because he'd critique your pasta sauce, but because he'd probably bless it with the warmest smile. When he was elected in 1958, many thought of him as a placeholder pope, a safe and unassuming choice to keep the Vatican comfy and cozy. But oh, how they underestimated him. What the cardinals got instead was a man with a vision so grand, it felt like a spiritual earthquake. And the tremor's name? The Second Vatican Council. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine the Catholic Church as a grand old mansion. It's beautiful, historical, but let's be honest. It's got some creaky floorboards, a few cobwebs in the corners, and a doorbell that hasn't worked since the Renaissance. John XXII took one look at this mansion and essentially said, Time to open the windows and let some fresh air in. That's literally how he described his intention for Vatican II, a great aggiornamento, or updating, of the Church. When the council was announced in 1962, jaws dropped. Some thought John was a bit too ambitious for his own good, like a chef trying to reinvent lasagna. Who dares mess with perfection? But John didn't flinch. For nearly 3 years, bishops and theologians from all corners of the globe gathered in St. Peter's Basilica, a site that must have looked like a Catholic United Nations. And what did they talk about? Everything from how Mass should be celebrated to the Church's stance on modernity. Latin, the Church's ancient liturgical language, wasn't banished, but it stepped aside to make room for vernacular languages. For the first time, people could understand what was being said at Mass without needing a pocket dictionary. But John didn't stop at just the internal matters of the Church. He had his sights set on something even bigger, ecumenism. Now, that's a fancy word for, can't we all just get alongs? John wanted Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and even folks who checked the none of the above box on the religion survey to come together in dialogue and mutual respect. It was a bold move, considering centuries of theological squabbles and, let's face it, a few unfortunate wars. One of his most iconic moments came when he met with leaders of other faiths, breaking centuries of icy distance. John's approach was simple yet revolutionary. Treat everyone like they're part of your family. Sure, some of your relatives might annoy you at Christmas, but you still pass them the gravy. That was John's spirit, a pope who believed in healing old wounds with kindness rather than judgment. John XXII didn't live to see the council's conclusions. He passed away in 1963, his humility and warmth still echoing through the Vatican halls. But his legacy? Oh, it's monumental. Vatican II transformed the Church, making it more accessible and responsive to a rapidly changing world. It was like updating your grandparents' old rotary phone to smartphone. Sure, there were some hiccups, but suddenly, the Church was speaking the language of the times, literally and figuratively. And so, good Pope John remains a figure of enduring admiration, a gentle yet determined shepherd who didn't just open the Church's windows, but threw open its doors, inviting the world to step inside. His humor, humanity, and daring spirit remind us that sometimes the best revolutions come with a warm smile and a little divine inspiration. Pope Urban II, a man with a knack for the dramatic, walked onto the stage of history in 1095 and delivered what can only be described as the ultimate medieval pep talk. Picture this. The fields of Clermont in France filled with a ragtag audience of knights, nobles, and peasants, all waiting to hear what the Pope had to say. Urban, never one to disappoint, stood up and unleashed an oration so fiery it practically set the Holy Land ablaze from afar. With his words, he summoned a cause that would unite, and sometimes divide, Europe for centuries. The First Crusade. Now, let's be clear. Urban wasn't just calling for a pleasant stroll to Jerusalem. Oh no, this was a call to arms, a spiritual quest, and, let's be honest, a medieval marketing masterclass all rolled into one. The slogan, Deus Vult, God wills it. It caught on faster than a viral TikTok trend. Urban promised forgiveness of sins, eternal glory, and possibly the best posthumous real estate deal ever. A guaranteed spot in heaven. Who could resist? Forget earthly taxes or your annoying neighbor lording it over you. Here was a chance to trade all that for eternal bliss. Of course, Urban wasn't just winging it. He had a plan, several. In fact, on the surface, it was all about helping out fellow Christians in the Byzantine Empire who were under siege by Seljuk Turks. But dig a little deeper, and you find a pope playing 4D chess. Europe at the time was a bit like a medieval mosh pit. Crowded, chaotic, and full of knights itching for a fight. What better way to channel all that pent-up aggression than by pointing everyone eastward? Urban essentially told them, why bicker over scraps here when you can claim a whole kingdom in the Holy Land? It was a brilliant move, one that might make Machiavelli nod in approval. Now, to the positive side. The First Crusade did achieve its immediate goal. Jerusalem was captured in 1099, and Christian control was established over key territories. The Crusaders' journey also facilitated a surprising amount of cultural exchange, though much of it was accidental. Returning knights brought back exotic goods, advanced scientific knowledge, and even spices that would eventually spice up European cuisine. Imagine dinner without pepper. Terrifying, right? Urban's vision also marked a turning point in uniting Western Europe under a single cause, showing that when they weren't busy fighting each other, Europeans could pull off something truly monumental. But let's not polish Urban's halo too quickly. The First Crusade also came with a heap of controversy. For starters, his call to arms unleashed a torrent of violence long before the Knights even reached the Holy Land. Jewish communities in Europe faced horrifying massacres at the hands of overzealous crusaders who, apparently, decided that cleansing the infidels could start closer to home. Urban probably didn't intend this, but the road to Jerusalem and to historical infamy is paved with good intentions, isn't it? And then there's the small matter of what happened during the Crusaders' grand arrival in Jerusalem. If you think Black Friday at a shopping mall is chaotic, you haven't seen anything. The Crusaders took the city in a bloody siege, leaving a trail of carnage that horrified even some of their contemporaries. A glorious victory for Christendom, the chronicles proclaimed, but one can't help but hear the uneasy shuffling of medieval historians trying to spin the PR. Urban II himself didn't live to see the Crusade's success or its Messier details. He passed away in 1099, just 2 weeks after Jerusalem fell. Talk about timing. One might imagine him entering the afterlife, looking at the chaos he set in motion, and muttering, "Well, that escalated quickly." In the grand scheme of things, Urban's call to the First Crusade was a watershed moment, a mix of idealism, ambition, and unintended consequences. His fiery speech rallied a continent and altered the course of history. But like any great story, it's a mix of triumphs and tragedies, noble aspirations, and darker deeds. Urban may have been aiming for heaven, but he certainly stirred up a lot of hell along the way. Pope Leo III, a man who knew how to turn a bad situation into one of most epic power moves in history. Picture this. It's Christmas Day in the year 800. The air is crisp, the streets of Rome are bustling, and inside the Grand Basilica of St. Peter, something monumental is about to happen. But let's rewind a bit, because Leo's road to glory wasn't all incense and hymns. It involved scandal, rebellion, and a bit of cunning that would make even a Machiavellian schemer nod in approval. Leo wasn't exactly the most popular guy when he became pope in 795. Rome was a city full of factions, and his enemies weren't shy about showing their disdain. In fact, they weren't content with just bad-mouthing him over wine. No, they ambushed him, dragged him through the streets, and tried to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue. Let's just say these weren't your average political disagreements. Miraculously, Leo escaped, and in true action hero style, he fled to the one man who could save him, Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, a guy who didn't just command armies, but practically had destiny written all over him. Charlemagne welcomed Leo like a long-lost brother, or at least a very useful ally. Leo pleaded his case, probably throwing in a few dramatic pauses and gestures for effect. Charlemagne, being the savvy ruler he was, saw an opportunity. Here was a pope in need, and Charlemagne could swoop in as a savior. And what do saviors get? Rewards, alliances, and maybe even a shiny new title. So, Charlemagne escorted Leo back to Rome in 800, where the Pope cleared his name in a trial that was about as unbiased as a kid judging their own art contest. And then came the big day. Christmas morning, with the church packed to the rafters, Leo made his move. As Charlemagne knelt in prayer, Pope Leo placed a glittering crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. Bam! The Holy Roman Empire was born, and Charlemagne was now the big cheese of Christendom. But here's the kicker. Charlemagne reportedly wasn't thrilled about the surprise coronation. Some say he didn't want to seem like his authority came from the Pope. After all, kings like their power to seem as divine and self-contained as possible. Still, Leo had essentially pulled off the ultimate PR stunt. By crowning Charlemagne, he didn't just make a political alliance. He tied the church to the most powerful ruler in Europe, ensuring that the papacy would wield influence over emperors for centuries to come. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy or manipulation, depending on how you look at it. Leo managed to turn his humiliating early troubles into a triumph that redefined the balance of power between church and state. Sure, Charlemagne might have grumbled about being caught off guard, but the partnership between Pope and Emperor laid the foundation for medieval Europe's political order. Pope Leo III wasn't just a man of God. He was a man of grit, guile, and guts. And let's face it, anyone who can go from being a street-battered fugitive to the architect of an empire deserves a bit of applause, and maybe even a reality show. Just imagine, the real popes of the Holy See. Now that would be divine. Pope Gregory I, affectionately known as the Great, was not your run-of-the-mill pontiff. This was a man who could multitask his way through plagues, barbarians, and a crumbling Roman Empire without breaking a sweat, or at least without losing his halo. Imagine inheriting a world where civilization seemed to be on the verge of collapsing faster than an over-soaked biscotti, and you'll get a sense of the challenges Gregory faced. Yet, instead of throwing in the papal towel, Gregory rolled up his metaphorical sleeves and got to work, leaving an indelible mark on the medieval world. For starters, Gregory was a maestro of church administration. The church in his time was less an organized institution and more of a holy free-for-all. Bishops were doing their own thing, monasteries were like independent franchises, and priests were, well, let's just say some were better at pouring wine than offering spiritual guidance. Gregory swooped in and decided it was high time to bring some divine order to the chaos. He restructured the church with the precision of a Roman engineer, streamlining its operations and ensuring that every bishop knew who was boss. Spoiler, it was Gregory. This reorganization allowed the church to act as a stabilizing force in a world where stability was about as common as an honest tax collector. But Gregory's genius wasn't confined to paperwork and protocol. Oh no, this was a man who could make spirituality sing, literally. Enter the Gregorian chant. Before Gregory, liturgical music was a bit of a mixed bag, varying wildly from region to region. Gregory, with an ear for melody and a heart for the divine, decided the church needed a universal soundtrack. He championed the development of a plain chant that was both beautiful and meditative, designed to lift souls heavenward. The Gregorian chant wasn't just music. It was a mystical experience, a kind of medieval Spotify playlist that united congregations across Christendom. And let's be honest, what other pope can say they've had their name immortalized in the music genre? Pope DJ Gregory, anyone? Of course, Gregory's impact went far beyond admin wizardry and choral innovation. His spiritual leadership transformed medieval Christianity. He was a relentless advocate for the poor, channeling church resources into feeding the hungry and caring for the sick during times of famine and plague. In a world where social safety nets were about as real as unicorns, Gregory became a one-man welfare state, embodying the very essence of Christian charity. His writings, particularly the Pastoral Rule, became a manual for clergy on how to be, well, less selfish and more Christ-like, a revolutionary concept for some. Gregory even found time to correspond with queens and kings, not to mention spar with the Lombards, a barbarian tribe with a penchant for causing trouble. His diplomatic skills were so sharp, he could have negotiated peace between a cat and a mouse. Through his efforts, he not only kept the Lombards at bay, but also cemented the Pope's role as a political power broker, laying the groundwork for the medieval papacy's central role in European affairs. Pope Gregory I was, in short, a man for all seasons, admin genius, music patron, diplomat, and shepherd of souls. He may not have had Instagram to capture his papal feats, but his legacy endures, proving that even in the darkest of times, greatness can shine through. And somewhere in the celestial realms, Gregory is probably still humming a tune, organizing angels, and chuckling at how his chants outlived the barbarians.